Hello, everybody. I think we'll probably get some more people joining as we start, but it's 1 p.m., so I'm just going to start us off. Um, so welcome back to our webinar series for the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky Living Lab project. My name is Megan. I'm on the Bridge Communications team, and I will be your host for today's webinar. As we continue to build respectful relationships, we would like to begin with a call to gather, drumming and singing by Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, to appreciate the cultural practices of the Indigenous partners guiding this project. The drum is considered a connection to the natural world, and together, drumming and singing are essential elements that help maintain Indigenous identity and cultural heritage. All right, so I'll quickly go over a protocol for today. So all participants are muted. You won't have access to switch that off. The webinar is being recorded. We will have it up on our YouTube page within the next week or so. There are closed captions available on the toolbar. And last but not least, we will have a Q&A period at the end of the webinar. But feel free to enter any questions that you have throughout the webinar at any point as you think of them. But yeah, we will have a dedicated question and answer period at the end. All right, so in today's webinar, Integrated Approaches to Weed Management, Dr. Shaun Sharpe will discuss simple practices that can manage weeds such as scouting, crop rotations, integrating perennials, and understanding weed ecology. Shaun will share field margin to field margin perspectives and perennial considerations to better understand and manage weeds, where and when they occur, and highlight successes from the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky project. Dr. Shaun Sharpe is a research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and he is committed to supporting Canadian producers and landowners, particularly in Saskatchewan and the prairies, by addressing complex challenges in weed science. His work focuses on weed ecology and integrated weed management strategies to control troublesome species, mitigate herbicide resistance, and adapt to environmental stressors. With academic achievements spanning Mount Allison University, Dalhousie University, and the University of Florida, Shaun brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So we have something we like to do throughout our webinars. We call them bridge breaks, and they're just little questions that we would love for you guys to answer. So the way to do it, you'll see that little QR code in the corner of the screen there. And you can access through there, or you can see at the bottom, join@slido.com, and that's the number. So once you get there, we have our question at the top. What's your biggest weed management challenge? So we'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that. Oh, yeah, kochia. That's a big one. I think, I feel like most people are going to say kochia. Oh, okay. We've got some others here. Thyme, yes. Wild mustard. Managing weeds around water bodies. That's very interesting. Okay, herbicide resistance. That's coming. Yeah, that seems to be a big one then. That's way bigger than all the others. Oh, I see someone wrote in the chat, Canada thistle. Yes. That's another one. Okay, well, I mean, yeah, these are all, I think, pretty common ones, but herbicide resistance seems to be the biggest. And kochia, there we go. Okay. Oh, someone else wrote in the chat, Japanese knotweed. Interesting. Well, I know Shaun definitely is going to touch on a few of these things throughout the webinar. So yeah, that's great that some people are having issues with that. Okay, I think I'll move on. And actually, that's it for me. So I'm excited to introduce Shaun, and yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, everybody. I always flip up and say good morning, so I'm glad I caught myself today. Thank you, Maddie. So my talk today is going to be about integrated approaches for weed management. And so for today's talk, I have based this around a publication that was put out in the US that was a collaboration from many of my weed science colleagues who are dealing with herbicide-resistant weeds in the corn and soybean production areas, as well as the cotton production areas. So they've come up with a list of BMPs, and what I've done and what I'm going to present today is going to be taking that framework and applying it to the prairies and the prairie systems, particularly small grains and canola and pulses. So these recommendations, I try to be as broad as possible to, and so therefore it would be across a lot of different cropping systems, but small grains would be a particular focus, of course, and annual crops. And yeah, so for this, it is largely targeted for reducing the risk and occurrence of resistance, but this also will conceptualize to help with other pressures in other areas as well. So while it is very narrow on herbicide resistance, there will be parts of the ecology that will help in other areas as well. So I realize there's a lot of words on the screen here, but what I want to draw to you will be on, or draw you to, is on the right side of the screen. So there are 4 groups of BMPs. I've switched the terminology to beneficial instead of best. I feel like this is a bit more of an appropriate use. And so there's the premise BMP, which is to reduce the soil seed bank. This is going to be the underlying crux to all of the rest of the BMPs. Then there's the knowledge BMPs, which I will spend quite a bit of time on today, which includes scouting and understanding weed biology. There's the control BMPs, which is your typical IWM strategies. So all of the physical, cultural, herbicidal, and biological control options through using a diverse approach. We don't want to use the same approach over and over again because that's likely what got us into problems with resistance, in particular in the first place. And then we have the space-time BMPs, which are like the plus on an IWM strategy, where we want to consider how to manage weeds from before we seed until after we harvest, as well as from margin to margin, and consider how the weeds are moving in the landscape. All right, on to the premise, which again is going to be to reduce the soil seed bank. And largely this is all about preventing weed reproduction. All right, so I want to just take a step back as we approach the premise, and I want to consider how we view the land, and that there are forces in nature that are happening to that land called secondary succession. And so this can be visualized in our cropping systems. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it follows a fire event in a climax community, and then how the plant community responds over time with the invasion of what are called pioneering species, as well as the establishment of perennial grasses and forbs, and then you get more complex life into the intermediate species, as well as it will reach the end at the climax community, depending on moisture and stability, of course. So in our production systems, we actually keep it very close to the 0 mark because we do things like tillage, we spray herbicides, we come through and combine and take all the grain off and destroy all the above ground vegetation. So actually we do, from this perspective, then the weeds that we see are described as pioneering species like kochia and wild oat, green foxtail. These are annual weeds that are coming from either 2 places after this after the disturbance, they're either coming from the soil because the seeds had been deposited there previously, called the soil seed bank, or they're going to be moving in from the margins or other undisturbed areas, like a slough, for example, where there's weeds catching around there, and they're going to come back in from the field edges. So this will be the most complex math I think I'll be showing you, hopefully. So this is how to calculate resistance risk, and this is kind of a very simple approach. It is very complicated, so I don't want to oversquare it too much, but the main element that I want you to get from this is that with resistance, it comes down to the risk of the herbicide. For example, the group 2 chemistry, we do develop resistance more frequently than we do for others, like the group 9, the group 10s. So there is some differences with the herbicides, but the main driving factor is going to be how many weeds we have to kill. And I like to explain this as playing the genetic lottery that we don't want to win, because eventually, due to target site mutations and how genetics work, if you have enough standing variation, you may select for something in the field that can tolerate, that can resist that herbicide. And then because there's lots of resources present and space and light, it'll grow and reproduce where all of its neighbors are now passed away. So the main emphasis here, and this can be conceptualized to other management practices, is not just for herbicides, but for any kind of disturbance-based pressure that we're putting on the plants. So basically, I just want to say kill less weeds. We can still spray the herbicides as we need to. They're still an important tool, but we need to be careful how we use them and take some of the pressure off of the herbicides by having to kill fewer plants with any given application. And then there is a sum symbol there, and this is kind of where the diversity in chemical options comes in, and I'll talk about this later, but when you do rotate, then you don't get that risk. But if I'm growing canola snow, and spraying glyphosate at every timing, that is when that risk starts to accumulate, as an example. I don't encourage that, but that's kind of how it's easy to visualize. So back to the premise. So the overarching goal is we want to have the weed seed and the emerged weeds from the soil to be static or declining over time. We want to prevent weed reproduction. We want to have a perennial encompassing strategy that's going to take us from January to December, as well as from field edge to field edge, and be cognizant of where the weeds are in the field. And we want to do this before planting because, unfortunately, and in particular with herbicide resistance, there are very few options to manage the weeds once they are emerged and escape our early management interventions like in-crop herbicides. Hand weeding is very, very expensive. And at the acreage that we are farming in the prairies, it's just not practical. Next, we're going to move into the knowledge of EMPs, and these are for scouting and knowing weed biology. So first, I want to talk about scouting. Scouting is very important, but it's also very challenging in the prairies since, as I mentioned, we have expansive areas that we want to farm, and that we are growing grain and oil seeds and pulses on, but it can be very challenged to keep up the weeds, especially weeds that can move either in the wind or in our grain. So we want to do this as often as possible, and this will help us evaluate how well our previous year's management strategy has worked. So we want to identify the weeds to the species level. We want to know where they are, what densities are they, and what size are they when you're going in. For a weed like kochia, it's one of the first ones to emerge, and it can be all different stages in the field. So it's good to note the staging because that's going to influence herbicide applications and other things. So there's three main timings that I would suggest for scouting. One is pre-seed to help plan your pre-seed weed management options, and then you have after herbicide applications, particularly for resistance, as well as in the post-harvest environment. So these are some site visit notes that I made in the very first few visits that we did to look at the potential sites for the bridge to land, water, sky, where we would be putting the experiments out onto the land. And I just wanted to understand the type of weeds that we were seeing and the complex area that we were doing. So actually with the bridge site, it does span the boreal transition and the Aspen parklands. So we do see quite different flora of weeds. This is due to the soil type and other demographic and other parameters for the environment. So in the boreal transition is typically a little bit more rich in the number of weeds you see, if you can use the word rich for that. Whereas in the Aspen Parklands, this is a little drier. So we tend to see more of the wild oat and kochia, which is more of a historic pattern. And then on the bottom there, on your left, it is false cleavers from a plot study I have, growing it out to look at its ecology. And then in the middle is wild oat. Those are panicles of the seed that are getting ready to mature and shatter. And then on the right is a picture of the kochia flowers or inflorescence. They are quite yellow, bright, and full of pollen at this stage. And I have actually learned that it can be an allergen as well. So caution if you're out scouting and trying to find flowering kochia. So this is a bit of a summary that I had calculated to show some of these calculations that I suggest. So in the first column, you have the species of the different weeds that we encountered when we were out on survey. We have the relative abundance in the weed community. The higher the relative abundance, the more present it is. And it's an average of 3 metrics that are followed: the frequency, field uniformity, and field density, but they're averaged so that they're in the same units, which are a percent. Then we have the frequency. This would be the percent of fields that we found the weed in overall. So we found this in 3/4 of the fields that we were in, for example, with the wild buckwheat on the very top. The field uniformity explains how widespread through any given field the weed is. So it was in 32% of the quadrats that we were using to measure through the field. And then, of course, the field density, which is a very important consideration for herbicide resistance risk, is in the last column. And of course, the wild buckwheat scores top there as well. And a lot of the weeds don't really register below 1. It's good to see, especially those noxious asters and the kochia there. So when it comes to scouting after spraying, you can typically start heading out about a week or 2 after you've applied. You start, for most of the herbicides, the symptomology that the plants produce should be quite easy to see at that point. And then I've given some timelines here for how fast some herbicides work. So for the pre-emergence herbicides, it depends a little bit on when you applied it, if you're applying them in the fall versus spring, but they're not going to stay in the soil forever, hopefully. So typically 3 to 4 weeks after emergence or treatment is when the efficacy of those herbicides will start to wane. So that's when you'll start seeing more weeds come out of the soil. Whereas with herbicides that you apply to the foliage, there's 2 types. There's the contact types, and those ones act quite quickly. Usually you're going to see death within 2 weeks. Whereas with the translocating, or is it herbicides, where the herbicide is now moving throughout the plant in the phloem or the sugar streams, that can take up to 3 to 4 weeks, really, depending on the type of herbicide. So they will kill just a little bit slower than the contact types. All right, next, I want to spend some time on understanding weed biology. I've come up with an ecological profile point system here to give you a quick overview of the different types of weeds and kind of how you can group them or class them. So some important considerations are its life cycle is an annual or perennial. Things like Canada thistle, of course, are perennials. The horsetails are perennials, whereas annuals are the wild oat, the kochia. We have the emergence patterns. So when is it going to emerge from the ground? Because that will help you time when you need to do management interventions. I have flowering time on here. This is important because in things like kochia, the herbicide resistance traits can move in the pollen, so we want to prevent pollen movement. And typically with herbicides, once the plant starts to flower, its tolerance to the herbicide or its ability to just shrug off the herbicide is going to increase because of that physiological change. And then, of course, we want to know how that weed is going to move in the environment. So we want to know its dispersal method. This first one I've developed is kochia. So I spent a lot of time on kochia and wild oats. I'm going to present one of each to you and then talk a little bit about their background. So for kochia, please put in the chat how you feel about kochia. For me, kochia is a weed, of course. It's an unwanted plant that farmers are dealing with, but from an academic perspective, it's also the weed that I study. So I do get a bit animated when I talk about it, but that's because it's the topic of my study. I still consider it a weed. It's unwanted to my stakeholders and my clients. So of course we want to get it out of here. So please feel free to put your thoughts on kochia in the chat. Thank you, Meg. Very annoying. So for kochia's ecological profiles, it's an early emerging spring annual. So April, usually, I'm going out and I'm starting to see it. I'm going to show you some pictures from the field. This one is from the greenhouse, so it's a little bit more stretched out than we see in the field. But I like this picture because it helps you see the trichomes or the hairs that are on the leaves, which can be an obstacle for getting herbicide spray into the plant when they're really small. So they do have a very long growing season. So they're actually one of the last weeds to mature, which is kind of weird actually, because you would think since our crop production cycle is shorter, then that wouldn't be a problem. But the kochia, we're actually seeing it start to adapt and get in line with our spring annual production systems. So that's not good. Kochia is patch forming. It is a tumbleweed, so it's going to spread its seeds largely as the tumbleweed or the diaspore breaks off at the soil surface, tumbles in the wind, and then you typically get a heavy dump of seeds in where it lands or where it travels. So you'll see streaks of green in the spring, for example, as the kochia is emerging and there's not much else growing. Typically, that's a pretty good telltale that you have a lot of kochia immigrating through your field. It's a high seed producer, and they also will compensate. So if you have a high density, you get a high amount of biomass. If you have a low density, unfortunately, you get a high amount of biomass. So that's concerning. And then, but the one chink in its armor, if you will, is it has a very short soil persistence. So it doesn't last very long. The soil, typically it's two to 3 years, they think, from previous studies, is about how long it will stay there. That's about 95%. There's always that tail end. And of course, it moves in the environment as well. So you can have seed put back into the soil from the tumbling tumbleweeds. So the next ecological profile is on wild oat. And so this is a very different species, a very different creature. It is, again, a spring annual, but unlike kochia, which doesn't last very long in the soil, wild oat will stay there for a decade. So it has a very complex dormancy in its seeds that allow it to stay in that soil. And it has been observed to have a flush of emergence after a rainfall. Typically, that's because moisture is limiting, particularly to it, because it uses a lot of moisture. And what I'm going to talk about in more detail here next is that it's a crop mimic for our small grains. Wheat, barley, oats, those sorts of things. So it emerges when we're planting them, it's starting to shatter, which means the seed is moving off the plant back into the soil around the same time that we're harvesting. And therefore, a major vector for it is actually a grain contaminant. It's moving into the seed, and that's how it's moving through the fields, unlike kochia, which is tumbling in the wind. Both of these weeds, of course, are very prone to developing herbicide resistance as well. So I've been a bit granular and narrow. So now we're going to go way back, way back, and have a look at the origin stories for wild oat in the prairies. We call this the great grain robber. It's been a problem since the 1900s. I found documents from the government that talk about wild oat problems. So I went to have a look at the research to see what is the story about this crop mimicry. So that's the story that I'm hoping to tell here. So in this first study, and just a quick caveat as well, I'm going to mention a lot of carbon dating dates, and I'm mostly doing this to tell you a story on a continuum. I do acknowledge there could be problems with the carbon dating and extrapolation, but That aside, I'm mostly trying to use this to anchor things in time, and if that compresses or expands, that's not a big deal. So according to this research, about 14,000 years ago, there were people in Jordan from the Natufian culture, and they were making bread in this area. And so there was something that happened, and the bread was charred, but it was preserved. And then archaeologists came in, and then they studied the plant material that was in the bread to give an idea of what the people were eating at that time. So from the picture, this is the stone area where it was found, and then in the middle is the oven part where the actual bread was found. So it was largely club rush tubers, which is an aquatic rush, but they also found a number of wild grains, including what would become many of the crop species that I'm going to show you soon, which is acorn, wheat, barley, and oats. So this was the earliest kind of reference to oat that I was able to find across the different species. So the Fertile Crescent is one of the oldest areas to be settled for farming in the world that we know about from this type of research. The founder crops were emmer wheat, acorn wheat, barley, peas, lentils, chickpea, flax, and bitter vetch. And if you're farming in the prairies, I think a lot of those will be quite familiar to you. We did bring them over with colonization, of course, and that is what we typically farm here in the prairie. And I just wanted to reference as well that the Torah is also quite old and is found in this area. And quite interestingly, these crops are also mentioned in the Torah in Deuteronomy as being blessings from God, whereas the weeds, particularly thorns and thistles in this case, but it is conceptualized in other scripture to be a curse on man. This part in Genesis, of course, is the fall of man, so that's one of the early curses described in the Bible. So this is my hand drawing from that previous research on where the Fertile Crescent is with a modern map overlaid. So depending on which author you look at, it may also include Egypt. It's Cyprus on the west side there, but it does include Israel, Jordan, Palestine, of course, would be in there, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the western part of Iran, parts of Kuwait, and some of the southern parts of Turkey. So it is quite a larger geographic region that they have been detecting these archaeological remains for. So again, this is where the crops came from that the weeds are now competing in. So when it comes to oats and wild oat in particular, according to the research, they think it likely originated, at least as far back early as we can tell, around Spain, Portugal, Algeria, and along the coast on the eastern or on the western Mediterranean. So Diamond and Bellwood believe that the spread of agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent happened around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. If we take that bread as an example, there is a good opportunity that these types of grains had already spread through the use of humans and animals. So this is around the time period that I believe that wild oats started to compete with the cereals. So what does that mean for crop mimicry? Well, what that means basically is I believe that the wild oat has had thousands of generations to grow in the grains over time and adapt to how we are farming. So in modern times, wild oats still a major issue in small grain cereals. So again, the wheat, the durum, the barley. If you look at the HR reports and the wheat surveys for the prairies, it's been widespread. It dominates the wheat community. For this reason, I believe, because it spread through the grain very early. The earliest reports are from 1622 in Newfoundland and then spreading in Eastern Canada, Quebec, and Ontario since the 1940s. And as I mentioned, in the prairies, it's been a problem since the 1900s as well. So this adaptation, this mimicry takes on the form of the wild oat growing in the same shape and form as the cereals, and it's going to ripen at the same time as the cereals, and the seeds that it's producing, the shape and the size are going to match the cereals. So how can we consider this type of adaptation from the weeds point of view? So if you think about mimicry in butterflies, it looks like there's eyes on its wings to prevent a predator. So take that concept and apply it here. We are the observer to the weeds, just like the predator is the observer to the insect, or the butterfly in this case. And so the crops have a certain form and we want them there and we're planting them there. And then the weeds come in and we are missing the weeds that look like the crops. And these adaptations can be described as giving it invasiveness so that it can access new habitats as farmland that we are now converting over to grow the grain. And it's reproductive, meaning it allows it to go to seed and produce more of itself. And again, this is because it emerges and it shatters like our cereals, and therefore it's getting into the grain and moving through the landscape that way. And things are very complicated because it has a very long and complex dormancy in the seeds. And that includes that when the wild oat is emerging in the growing season, it's coming up after the in-crop herbicides are applied. And I'll talk about that in a bit more coming up. So this is a paper from 1929. It's a barley breeder from Arizona. And they were struggling with wild oats here. This is actually, I kind of wish I could write like this nowadays, but they've made the writing in the science a bit more dry. He starts off by saying, they say, you must suffer to understand I've suffered. And then he gets into the narrative and he talks about the equipment that he was using at this time point to try to manage these weeds as a breeder. And he's got a jackknife, he's got a bag and a club. And it took him a long time. And in the last little excerpt that I put there, he talks about how it was taking more and more time every day. And the more he became trained his eyes to see the weeds, the more weeds that he found. And they just kept emerging all season long. And so he gave a pretty good description of this crop mimicry happening in the fields, because where he was a breeder, he was growing spring and winter barley in the same field. And then so he was able to see kind of on your left on the upper panel is the wild oats growing in winter annuals, and then on the bottom panel is the same wild oats in the same field growing in a spring barley. And then in the middle picture there, he calls it the long and the short of it, and he just shows the comparison between the two. So that's how that mimicry can be seen in nature. And of course, this will have complications for things like precision ag, where we're trying to detect it, and it's actually very challenging. So now we're going to move into the control of BMPs. And again, this is a big part of the IWM strategies. So we wanted to use a diversified approach. This is very important. We were perhaps historically a bit more precise in our approaches. We were using a limited number of approaches and chemicals. So here we want to use as many as possible and to integrate and to diversify over time and space. We want to target the weeds that are going to be the most problematic. So for example, with the bridge, that would be wild buckwheat. And of course, kochia and wild oat are very prone to resistance. So of course, you should always keep an eye on them. And we want the soil seed bank to be static or declining. We want to use as many approaches as possible to prevent weed reproduction. So this is an example spray threshold framework from the 2020 Guide to Crop Protection that's put out from the ministry. This is still very good and appropriate, and this is how you can predict when to spray early season and to keep the weeds from stealing your yield. And I think this is important, but what I want to emphasize is that we need to look beyond just this early timing, because we want to prevent weeds from going to seed. So we need to think about how can we manage the weed for the whole season, not just early season, to protect the yield. And of course, we do want to protect the yield, but it's going to be costly if we start to lose herbicides as well. But we don't really see that as easily upfront. So the fifth BMP is to use multiple modes of action for your herbicides. This is for a single species. This can be done through a tank mix, or you can spray them over time, like for canola, for example. With Liberty, you can spray 2 applications, I believe. So there are options there. And then, of course, you want to rotate the different modes of action between your different timings to make sure you're not over-reliant on one. This is some results from the bridge where we were doing some tolerance testing on some kochia just to see how the products were doing. The plants were a little too large to do a herbicide resistance diagnostic test. So this is just a tolerance test on how much injury the herbicides caused the kochia. And the orange lines are the herbicides that, after considering all of the different parameters, the injury, the biomass, and the survival, would be the best kind of options, with the red cells kind of indicating when performance was perhaps not the best, or not as high as I would have liked. You'll see for treatment 2 is Roundup or glyphosate. We know and have known for quite a while that glyphosate resistant is, of course, in kochia and has been spreading through the prairies. By about 2019, we were already seeing about 80% of the samples had glyphosate resistance. So this is not surprising. The other thing I'll note there is, for example, the treatment 3 and the treatment 8. Those are oxinic herbicides. So that would be in group 4. And we do know that kochia has already started to adapt and resist to those types of herbicides, both dicamba and fluroxypyr. It looks like the injury from the fluroxypyr still looks okay, so I don't suspect that there's concerns there, but it's just something to be aware of. So when you do have to deal with resistance, or perhaps you're just trying to incorporate a new mode of action into your program, when you switch modes of action, it's really important to check the label, because the staging of the kochia on that label may change, and the staging is very important. So we want to make sure we're spraying the full label rate. All right, don't cut rates. Please spray the full amount, and put it on the proper stage of kochia. And as you can see here, they use height and they use leaf number. One thing that I've noticed with contact herbicides is, once you start to see the plants branching, and that would be small little branches coming off the main stem, that's about the stage when your efficacy of things like carfentrazone or AIM are going to go down. So the branching means it might be getting a bit too big to spray. So BMP7 is to use cultural practices. There's a lot of these that can be incorporated. So this is a great way to diversify. I would say this is probably the best approach we have to kind of strengthening the herbicide backbone that we currently have in our production systems. A caveat, though, for crop rotations, is often touted that this will introduce new chemistry or new herbicides that weren't available in these other crops. I really don't find that's the case here in the prairies. Something like a chickpea, yes, there is options if you're in an area where you can grow it for a group 6 versus a group 5 or a group 4 in cereals, but largely across the pulses, the same types of chemistry are an option. So it doesn't really open that many new doors. I guess is what I'm trying to say. One opportunity to diversify is to change the type of life form. So is the wild oak competing with the grass versus the broadleaf? Are there different types of broadleaves that grow different ways? And then, of course, the ultimate change to that would be changing the life cycle. So going from a spring annual to an overwintering annual, like a fall rye or winter wheat, or a perennial forage like alfalfa. And there's a whole number of those as well. The main tenet that I want you to get is canopy closure. I think this is the best approach we can do. It's not a silver bullet by any means, but getting a nice competitive canopy for your crop is going to help you manage weeds through the whole season, because they're going to be there the whole season. Things like herbicides are very instantaneous usually, especially if you're spraying them on the foliage, whereas your crop canopy is going to be there for that whole period. So it's going to help you to keep the weeds down. You can achieve a competitive crop either through picking a competitive crop or a competitive cultivar. And we can also use planting dates and use a bit of weed ecology to determine when the weeds are there and maybe do some management then. So this is some work that was done previously that was published in the Agronomy Journal, and it's comparing both wheat and barley's ability to tolerate kochia interference. So how much yield does kochia steal from wheat and barley compared to when they're grown by themselves? So you have wheat on the left and the barley on the right. The triangles are kochia, and then the grain is the circle, wheat is the black circle, and barley the white circle. And where the two lines intersect, so where the X forms, gives you an idea of how competitive the crops are. So the X kind of forms about at 45% of the kochia proportion for the wheat, whereas in the barley, we can see that's over close to the 75%. So that just gives you an indication that the barley can tolerate the kochia and still produce yield with more kochia around compared to the wheat. So that would give an indication that barley is a better competitor than wheat, and this is not surprising. This has been shown against other weeds like wild oat as well. Another approach to closing canopy, getting a competitive stand, is to put down more seed. Seed is typically, except for maybe canola, is typically fairly cheap compared to other inputs. This is some research done by Steve Shirtliff's lab in 2009. The weeds are the squares on the graph. The crops, or sorry, the weeds are the black squares. The crops are the white squares. You have biomass on your y-axis and the rate of seeding on the x-axis. And around 80 seeds per square meter is the industry standard for peas, which is what this is. And then so as you can see, when you go out to 2x and above, for the seeding rate, you get a more competitive crop. It's producing more biomass, and there's less biomass for the weeds. There's less biomass for the weeds. Typically, there's less seed in the biomass, so you are preventing weed reproduction that way. And of course, in this research, there was also a bump in yield as well when they went up to the 2x seeding rate. So the next BMP is to use any biological or mechanical options where available. These goats are actually a friend of mine's from Florida, Kathy. They were not used in any research. They're just from her farm. And I just wanted to give an example for an option for targeted grazing. I know goats will eat some of the more problematic weeds and do so in a safe manner compared to some of our other livestock. So, but otherwise, for things like kochia and wild oat, where they are invasive, you don't really have a lot of good developed biological control programs. Those are costly and time consuming to do. So there's just not a lot of options right now. So from the mechanical point of view, of course, there's spot tillage. I have seen some growers doing this for things like kochia. Since it's an early emerger, they're able to till it under and then seed in their pulses, for example. Mowing is effective. I've done some research though, and you do have to go in 3 to 4 times per year at least if you're trying to mow a kochia. There's also something called crop topping or clipping. So things like wild oat, they do shoot up quite a bit above the canopy versus a lentil or a chickpea. So then you can mow over top of your crop and control the weed inflorescence that way. The next, we're going to move into our last set of BMPs, which is the space-time BMPs, talking about how to manage weeds from pre-seeding and the post-harvest environments, and then trying to manage field borders and the movement of seed. So the pre-seeding, this is a study out of Iowa, and they evaluated all of the different weeds coming out of the seed bank and then categorized them based off of the period which they were emerging, based on GDD, which is growing degree days, it's like temperature units, as well as the calendar date. And the line that you see extending down, I put this in as an example of when you might do a pre-seed herbicide application. And what I want you to see from this slide is at the top we have our early emergers. Right at the top is kochia. So if we're after kochia, we're going to spray then. What are we going to miss? And what we're going to miss down at the bottom are pigweeds. So redwood pigweed, common water hemp, which I know is a problem in Manitoba, spreading to Saskatchewan. So we need to design our management practices to ensure that we're not going to have escapes and weeds that come up later. So in the next BMP is to manage weeds at or after harvest. And of course, this is not a good opportunity to spray weeds to kill them. At this point, a lot of them are already gone to seed, but we want to prevent accumulation. So one newer technology that is available and has been researched both here and in Australia and in the US is harvest weed seed control, or these are terminators or destructors that they put on the back of the combine so that any of the chaff that comes into the combine will go through the mill, get ground into dust. The first panel on the left, this is a study from my colleague Bria Tyman from Macomb. And so she has evaluated on different types of weeds, from kochia, which is very, very small, to wild oat, which is typically fairly large as far as seeds go in the weeds world. And she was getting over 95% control of all the weeds that she put through the mill. So this is just to show it works on a large number of weeds. This is a broad spectrum solution. And then on the second panel, which starts at 97%, we have barley, canola, and pea chaff. And this is largely to show that the type of chaff does not matter. This can work in all of the different types of crops that we grow in annual grains. BMP 11 is to prevent movement within and between fields. This is largely one to target kochia from this perspective. We don't have a lot of fences. Do I think fences are going to be super effective? Not without a good strategy. This is off of Flickr, but I did like this image because it gives you a nice view of the weeds growing along a fence line. Now, if I had a kochia tumbleweed moving in the wind at a pretty good movement speed and it hit that fence, I would predict that I'm going to have seed dispersal on the other side of that fence. So next year, that kochia is going to grow on that other side of that fence and then continue on its journey to wherever it was heading. So a fence can work and tree lines can work, but we need to be mindful of the weeds that we're accumulating there. And we may need to use mowing or a broad spectrum herbicide of some sort to manage them there. The sanitation of your equipment is a major vector for moving weeds around. Combines spread weeds. So if you are starting to combine, maybe start in areas where are cleaner and then move to your dirtier fields. And that way, if you do have weed seed movement on your combine, you're at least depositing the weeds in areas where you already have problems. And you're not spreading problems to new areas where your fields are cleaner. And then kind of the hidden caveat here is with wild oat and using certified seed, it is on the weed order for the Seeds Act. So it is a regulated pest in that way. So buying certified seed helps you have less wild oat going into your field in the spring when you're planting. Our final BMP is to manage the field borders. So this image is when I was out on the kochia survey, and we've got I think it's a wheat stand there. It looks pretty good. And then you have that kind of greenish, bluish color. That's all kochia that's kind of gotten in between that perennial, which is on the left side of your screen, and the grain. So there was some sort of disturbance that happened where that perennial was, and then the kochia got in there. So having a strong competitive perennial on your margins is a good way to close the back door and keep the weeds from producing and then coming back in to the field. So we did evaluate some of this with the bridge through marginal land conversion. There are a number of reasons why land may be marginal or consider it marginal. It could have to do with the productivity or the composition of that soil. It may have to do with topography. And in the case for the bridge, it had to do with salinity. In areas that are more saline, the crops are typically not well adapted, so they may be stunted and growing less vigorously, producing less yield. Then you get a weed like kochia, tumbles in. It's a known halophyte, meaning it has adaptations to tolerate salt, so it's going to do well there. And what is the ground going to yield to you? It's going to yield to you kochia more so than grain or pulses. So then the idea here is to convert the land and then help keep the kochia down. So we did evaluations the year after on that track that you saw. And so we had gone in previously and saw that the kochia, there was a good amount of kochia there. And so we were able to kind of see where the whole patch was and then kind of monitor it in the crop field where we knew that it was previously, and then in where they had converted to a perennial forage. We measured in the spring. So this would have been after the forages are emerged, but there was no grain present or the grower hadn't seeded yet. And then we also measured pre-harvest to evaluate the number of kochia seedlings that were present or plants at that point. Kochia densities, as you can see from the screen, are not very fun to count. They come up like a carpet. The high selection pressure. So because I have a high density, I get a high variance. So I had to use a rank transformation here to be able to properly analyze the data. And we didn't really see a difference between timings, but we did see the effect of a lot less kochia in the forage compared to the cropland. And this was largely due to the reduction of these kind of mats that are present on the screen there. There would be transient plants. It's still, kochia in the areas is tumbling through, so there will be some in the seed bank, transient plants coming up. But in the forage, we didn't really see the establishment of those dense patches like we do in the cropland, so that was a very promising result. All right, so that reaches the end. I just want to again summarize that the overall premise is we want to reduce the soil seed bank. We want to have less weeds than we need to kill next year. So we want to do a good job of keeping the weeds from going to seed. We want to understand what we're trying to kill, and we want to understand where it is. We want to use every control method that we have available because our herbicides are breaking, and the discovery of new herbicides is it's a very long process. So we're not going to have new ones coming very rapidly. So we want to use what we have currently and use them very carefully. And then we want to also get to consider space-time BMPs. We want to have a good perennial approach to this year to year, margin to margin, January to December. We want to think about how those weeds are moving in the landscape and what can we do to stop them. All right, this is our second bridge break. Please choose 2 BMPs from the list below that you are thinking of incorporating into your weed management plan. Just pause here to give folks a chance to be able to do that. Yeah, this is good feedback. I do know that the preceding timing is very challenging. That's when a lot of growers having to deal with kochia. Good to see this getting. I know that is challenging. I know we have a lot of land to cover. A lot of corners, the things that kochia can tumble into and hide and make it hard to get to, but it is very important. It's good to see the management of weeds after harvest too. There's a lot of options. I know I do cover the seed terminator, but there's a lot of other options there as well. My colleague, Dr. Brian Time, has done a lot of work in that area to help push our growers forward. So that's good to see as well. All right, thank you, everybody. So again, we want to just to summarize, we want to reduce the soil seed bank to prevent resistance risk as well as risk to our other types of strategies we're doing. With selection, it's not just about herbicides. It affects plants with whatever we're trying to do to them. So we want to know what we're trying to kill and we want to go look for it. That's the BMP for knowledge. In scouting, we want to use all the available tools. Diversification is so important. There's no silver bullet anymore. We need to use everything possible. And of course, we want to be mindful of our field edges and the movement of weeds on the landscape. I think that is it. It's my email. Happy to get questions there as well. So thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Megan.
For sure. Thanks so much, Shaun. That was very informative. We do have just one more quick survey. And I think we'll be able to get it up on the screen here as a QR code for you. All right. Okay. I think it's just that QR code on the bottom of the screen there, right above our website link. So I'll give everyone just a few minutes for that. I just want to say thank you again, Shaun, for your webinar. I know I definitely learned a few new things today, and I'm sure other people did as well. I noticed that we're past the 2 o'clock mark, which was what we designated for the webinar. So if you do need to head out, that's no problem. But hopefully we can get some questions going here in a second for Shaun. And yeah, again, like I said, feel free to write your questions out in our Q&A. Oh, one more thing as well. I know Shaun very briefly mentioned this in his webinar about marginal cropland conversion. I just want everyone to know we will actually be doing another webinar next week on marginal cropland conversion. So if you are interested in learning more about that, that registration is up on our website, same as this one was. So you can sign up for that as well. Looks like, oh, we have another way to access the survey as well in the chat there. I did want to address, someone had written previously, Shaun, they said, Sam said, a new problem here is poison ivy in cranberry fields. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that for a second.
Yeah, cranberries are tricky. I've been in a couple of cranberry fields. They're very unique areas, very limited options. I have a colleague, Dr. Hilary Sandler, University UMass, I think it is. I think she's retired now or near retiring, but she's got a lot of good research in cranberry. So I would recommend to have a look there. Maybe herbicidal options, depending on timing. I'm not super familiar with the production system to make a comment too strong on that, but where I would look for answers.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we do have another question here. I'm going to slowly transition into our question period. Would you ever recommend a fallow year with multiple monthly diskings to terminate the weed seed bank, or is this too detrimental to the soil?
Good question. Does tillage help? The answer is it depends. And I think for the weeds that we're talking about, if you're dealing with wild oat kochia, um, you can get some scarification. By that I mean the blades of the disc, for example, can nick and encourage or damage the weed seed, like on wild oat. But I think you're going to do more harm than good with that. You have a weed like a perennial, like Canada thistle, that would be a better target because you can break up the rhizomes repeatedly. And for something like Canada thistle, you need to be on top of it. I think it's every 4 days before it switches from a sink to a source, meaning you have 4 days before it will build back the carbon that it lost growing back from the ground. So, sorry to give a vague answer, but it kind of depends a little bit, I think. I wouldn't use it for wild oat or anything, but or kochia, very intermittent tillage on kochia, I think is effective because it doesn't tolerate burial. But I wouldn't do it frequently. It would just be once every, I don't know, 3 years or something, because you don't want to have it moving through your entire column of soil. You want to bury it and then leave it down there. So you wouldn't really want to go in multiple times. Yeah, so a bit of a, it depends, but I think, yeah, for a perennial, there's potential, but for annuals, I would say no, not really.
Awesome. He just in reply, Barry says,
Mm,
"Thank you. We've been trying to deal with it with wild mustard." Sorry, I might have read
mm,
that wrong.
oh. Yeah, and wild mustard's a tough one too, because they're so small seeded and they last quite a while in the soil. So you'd be fighting quite a seed bank there, I suspect.
For sure, yeah. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A for now. I think some people have had to head out. Sam saying keeping the soil covered with cover crop or having a strong crop with closed canopy is a key against weeds as well, just as another option there. Okay. Well, again, if you do think of other questions for Shaun, he had his email up on the screen there. But you can also email bridgetolandwatersky@gmail.com and we can pass those questions along to our speaker. We will have the recording. I think I've already mentioned this, but we will have the recording available to view on YouTube probably within the next week or so. So you can always head back there to look it over again. But yeah, I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Shaun, again. Appreciate it. And we look forward to, yeah, everyone else having a great day. All right.
Thanks, everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
I think we're back, Shaun.
All right.